The top business stories live from the Sky Newsroom. The UK's biggest water provider, Thames Water, is hit by a record-breaking £122 million fine. Grocery prices jumped to 4.1% in May, the highest level since February of last year. Plus, the world's biggest bank says a lack of access to critical resources is placing thousands of British start-up businesses at risk. Very good morning on this Wednesday, Business Live with me, Darren McCaffrey. Thames Water has been fined nearly £123 million in the latest penalty from the water regulator Ofwat. It's the biggest, in fact, it's ever issued. It follows two investigations into wastewater and dividend payments at the company. Ofwat says that the fine will be paid by the company and its shareholders rather than its customers. Let's speak to our business and economics correspondent, Gurpreet Narwan. Very good morning to you. A record-breaking fine, and this is for a whole series of different reasons, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right, Darren. It was split into two parts, so I'll just break it down for you. Firstly, there was 104.5 million that was related to an environmental fine because of water spills that Thames Water has overseen, and then another 18.2 million for breaking rules relating to dividend payments. And this is the first type of fine of this kind that the regulator has issued. And effectively what it said is that management was paying dividends to shareholders that did not reflect the performance of the company on several metrics, whether that's the environment or on customer value. And in particular, it mentioned £37.5 million worth of interim dividend payments that the company made in October 2023. It will now have to seek approval before it can make any further dividend payments. And all of this, of course, as you will know, is in the context of growing public outrage and regulatory scrutiny over Thames Water's record on the environment, on water spills, as well as financial mismanagement, actually not just at Thames Water, across the sector, across the water utilities. For many, what's happened, particularly at Thames Water, but across the sector, encapsulates the failures of the privatised model. Companies that were loaded up with debt, that money used to pay dividends to shareholders while chronically underinvesting in the network. It's exactly the type of behaviour you would expect a Labour government to be railing against. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the government wants to make a lot of noise about this. Steve Reid, the Environment Secretary, said it was an example of how the government was taking tough action on the water companies. He mentioned the 81 criminal investigations launched by the government since the election. But the problem with all of this, and Steve Reid will of course know this, is the harder the regulators and the courts bear down on Thames Water, well, the harder it becomes for the company to recover. It's already loaded up with debt. It's just sought another £3 billion loan to tide it over while it seeks further equity investment. But if it continues to be hit with fines like these, fines that it hasn't planned for, well, then it makes it harder to secure that investment. And at the same time, it means that its debt is more expensive, and the two combined mean that it's harder for the company to remain viable. And then, of course, the spectre of nationalisation looms.
This, as you say, may well mean at some stage that effectively nationalisation, even temporarily, is on the cards. Just what does it mean for customers? Many might think this could lead to higher bills.
Well, as you pointed out just there, it's basically been stipulated that these extra fines will be paid by the company, by shareholders, rather than from customers. But there's a lot of scepticism around that. Campaigners routinely, when Thames Water and other water companies make claims like this over fines, they routinely kind of query whether that is actually possible. And we know, for example, that Thames Water is seeking an appeal against the regulator's decision to increase customer bills by 35%. And that's huge. That's hundreds of pounds on the average bill. But the reason it wants to appeal that decision is because it actually wants more. It wants around 50% bill increases. And then the reason it says this is necessary is to invest in the network, but also to attract investors. We talked about how it needs investment in order to remain viable. And I think that pretty much encapsulates or epitomises how the interests of customers and the interest of the management of the company and of the shareholders are diverging so wildly.
Okay, Gurpreet, as always, appreciate your time this morning. Thank you very much for that. And indeed, there'll be more, of course, on that story on the Sky News Money blog, on the Sky News app, or indeed on the website. Now, grocery price inflation jumped to 4.1% over the 4 weeks to the 18th of May. That's according to the latest sales data. Price inflation hit the highest level since February 2024 due to an uptick in demand for barbecued goods and the good old sun cream, following, of course, the hottest start to May on record. Well, let's speak to the head of retail and consumer insight at Kantar. That's Fraser McKevitt. Very good morning to you, Fraser. So the hot weather has hotted up grocery prices.
Yeah, well, looking out the window today, I'm not sure I can quite remember it being so warm at the beginning of the month, but it was record temperatures pretty much all over the country in that first week of May. And we saw people do what Brits tend to do when the sun comes out. They go out and have a barbecue. So sales of burgers went up and all the accompanying salads and indeed sun cream. It was up by a third on the year before, because you almost certainly can't remember, but May 2024 was pretty miserable on the sunshine front. So people have really taken advantage.
Yeah, and sun cream's always a thing that I think I should buy and never get round to. Let's talk about who's benefiting from this, though, because it does seem that the low-cost kind of discounters, if you like, those supermarket chains, particularly the German ones, are seemingly benefiting from this increase as prices rise and consumers look for lower prices.
Yeah, it's probably doesn't feel like such a new story, the fact that Aldi and Lidl are doing well, but they've again reached new record high market shares this month. And collectively, they've grown stronger than they have done as a group for a little while. Now, this, I think, does link into the rising prices that we're seeing. So inflation of 4.1%, once inflation gets above that level of 4% in groceries, we know from the evidence, we know from the data, people start looking to ways to save money, and perhaps trying to shop somewhere else might be one of those. And then the other things that people do are look to buy cheaper products, which tend to be own label brands, own label lines, or they'd look to buy more on promotions. And we are seeing promotions going up in the supermarkets as well. We know there's a lot of talk about a supermarket price war out there at the moment, and there does seem to be some evidence for it. And what kind of promotions are retailers trying to get us to buy? Well, it's really simple price cut ones. It's not the complicated multi-buys where you feel you're buying more than you need. It's just straight money off offers.
And if Aldi and Lidl are the winners, as you say, a story that we have gotten used to, who's struggling here? Who are the losers in terms of the supermarkets?
It is incredibly competitive retail. So there's only space for so many retailers to win market share. And alongside Aldi and Lidl doing well, Ocado have now been the retailer that have been the fastest growing supermarket for a full year. They're only small. They're less than 2% market share. That's quite impressive. And then the juggernaut, Tesco, keeps rolling on. They're the biggest retailer in the country, and they're winning market share as well. Everybody else is flat on market share or losing, which shows it's just a fixed pie. And that's why the supermarkets have to fight so hard on their price and on their service and their products to get us, the customers, to come through the door.
And just very finally, Fraser, one thing that did change last month, of course, was national insurance rises for everyone, but particularly big businesses, and supermarkets employ a lot of people in this country. Minimum wage went up too. It's going to cost hundreds of millions, maybe billions for these supermarkets. Is that going to feed, you reckon, into prices? Are we likely to see prices increase even in this competitive field in the months ahead?
So the supermarkets have been very vocal in what they see as these extra costs on their business. I wouldn't say there's a lot of wiggle room for them to put up prices with their customers, though. And the reason for that is it's simply so competitive. If I don't like the prices and the products I get in supermarket A today, I can easily move to supermarket B tomorrow. So yes, we will see when they put their financial results out what the effect of those rises are on their businesses. But I think they will be doing everything they can to try and limit those price rises because they simply don't want to put those up.
OK, Fraser, thank you very much indeed for your time there from Kantar. Thank you. Now, President Donald Trump has indicated that progress has been made in US trade talks with the European Union, which fueled a bit of a stock rally yesterday. However, the president has also repeated criticism of Brussels negotiators and defended his decision to threaten a 50% tariff on EU imports from the 1st of June, which has now been postponed to the 9th of July. Well, let's speak to the developed market economist at ING, that is James Smith. James, very good morning to you. Just first of all, give us a sense here of what we're talking about. We're talking about the world's largest economy, the United States, and the world's largest trading body in the European Union. There's a hell of a lot of trade there involved.
There is, yeah. And the reason that Donald Trump has been so irked by the EU is that, the EU has a surplus in goods trade with the US. So Europe is sending more goods to the US than vice versa. And that's long been a sort of thorn in the side of the US administration. And I think the problem here is that in the US's eyes, at least, talks haven't been moving quickly enough. And I think that's why, the president came in on Friday with that big threat for 50% tariffs, just to kind of inject a bit of momentum into those discussions. Clearly very difficult.
And James, isn't the problem here that, ideologically, clearly Donald Trump dislikes the European Union? He's called it effectively a body set up to rip off the United States. But in terms of the practical details, what are the sticking points beyond the surplus? What does Washington want to see change in Brussels? And what can Brussels potentially eke out in any deal from the United States?
Well, Brussels, I suppose, is trying to be pragmatic, and they're saying, well, what we'll give you is we'll reduce our tariffs on industrial goods and cars to zero if the US does the same. So it's like a 0 for 0 tariff exercise where both sides are reducing their barriers. The EU's offered to buy more liquefied natural gas, more soybeans. I think the US's perspective is, we're not looking for both sides to reduce tariffs. We're looking for Brussels to reduce tariffs here. This isn't an exercise where the US is kind of is going to be making those concessions. And I think the EU side is very reluctant to agree to something that looks like the deal that was done with us here in the UK, where, there's restrictions on potentially Chinese investment or, losing some sovereignty in that area. And of course, the UK didn't negotiate away that 10% baseline tariff. That's something the EU wants. So lots of tricky areas on substance.
And is there an opportunity here, James, for the European Union in the sense that it's notable that Emmanuel Macron, the French president, has been in Southeast Asia in the last couple of days? I think he talked about in Vietnam, kind of alluded to the fact that the United States isn't necessarily a reliable partner. And the EU are potentially going to try and make a land grab, if you like, for some trades, given the uncertainty with American politics at the moment. Is that fair?
Europe is certainly trying to diversify itself. And, we've seen some of that in talks with Britain, right? This is part of the reason that's motivating progress, both from the UK's perspective and Brussels in these talks that we've been seeing. Basically, they recognise that the US isn't as reliable a partner as it once was, both on trade and in other issues. And that's what's sparking discussions like these and with other countries as well.
And where are we going to end up with this? I mean, we've got this postponement, but, in theory, that 50% is still hanging over the EU when it comes to these tariffs. I mean, could the United States afford that in terms of having a 50% tariff? What effect would it have on the EU? Effectively, will we get to a deal because actually both sides will need a deal?
I think whether or not we get a deal is questionable. I think probably if you ask most investors, they say what will just happen is after the July deadline, the can gets kicked. The EU doesn't see those 50% tariffs. I suspect that's the base case of many people. I think 50% seems unlikely because, as you say, it would hit the EU quite hard, would push it closer to recession. But the US is already looking at a big slowdown as well. So it's a very difficult one. Of course, the tariffs that were announced in April did upset financial markets as well. So the US administration has got to tread carefully. But I think the risk is that tariffs do go back up in, for some countries, for some sectors over the next few weeks and months, maybe not as extreme as that 50%, but certainly seems to be a clear risk here.
OK, James, thank you very much indeed for your insight this morning there from ING. Thank you. Now, thousands of British startup businesses are at risk because of a lack of access to critical resources. That's according to new research from HSBC UK, which found that more than 1 in 4 UK entrepreneurs lack the resources and support they needed to start their business. Well, delighted to say we can speak to the head of business banking at HSBC UK. That is Tom Wood. Tom, very good morning to you. When you talk about critical resources for entrepreneurs, what are you talking about here? Give us a sense of what you think they're currently lacking.
Thanks, Darren. Well, we know startups and small businesses are the backbone of the UK economy, and they're vital for the success of the UK and the growth that we want to see. But we must equip them with the tools that they need to succeed. And as you say, the research that we've done recently shows that 1 in 4 of those founders are struggling or finding it difficult without key resources or support, and they can't find that support to help start the business and actually even once they're established, grow the business. And that's related to areas such as technology and innovation, marketing, and also finance. And sorry, please.
No, carry on. I was just going to say, I mean, you know, if that's the problem, how is it solved?
Well, HSBC have launched a small business growth program. We're stepping in with a free nationwide initiative to provide those SMEs with the vital tools that they do need to succeed. We're working with partners such as Microsoft and Wired and Upskill Universe to deliver content to SMEs through online tools, through training and through webinars. And our aim is this inclusive program that's open to all SMEs, not just customers of HSBC, will support that growth, support that upskilling. And we're aiming to reach over 1 million SMEs in the first 12 months with that program. And
has this changed, or has it been a long-term problem? I mean, we've talked a lot in the past about, you know, the fact that the UK in recent years actually has proven that small businesses can start here. Not all of them survive, of course. But are some of the fundamental problems around things like technology, and we've talked about that in relation to productivity in the past, they seem to be a long-term drag. Is that fair?
I think areas such as technology are fast-moving, and SMEs are looking for support to understand how they need to adapt quickly, and that's probably moved faster than some of the other areas. I should say SMEs in the UK continue to be very resilient. In a recent survey, we saw 77% of SMEs tell us that they have the resiliency and the capability to grow their business, despite, you know, the backdrop of the challenges I'm talking about and the lack of access to support or resources. So when you say that SMEs are so vital to our business and they have thrived, that they continue to do so, we just need to help them, I think, at this stage more than perhaps they've had in the past.
OK, Tom, and just one final question. Clearly, it's been in the news a lot recently, and that is hacking, particularly for businesses in the UK. And we're not going to talk about individual cases, but just in general, you know, as the head of business banking, and I see your colleague was suggesting that online criminals are targeting businesses and banks all the time. How big of a problem is it from what you see, and what are you guys doing to try and prevent it's from affecting not just your bank, but indeed the businesses that you deal with?
So cybercrime risk is a growing challenge in the economy in the world, as we know. My advice to customers is really make sure you understand that risk, stay vigilant and diligent on your own processes. Talk to us for support on how you can mitigate financial crime risk, but be alert to that challenge in the world right now.
OK, Tom, really appreciate your time this morning. That's Tom Wood there from HSBC. Thank you.
Thank you.
OK, you're watching Business Live here on Sky News. Coming up in just a couple of minutes, we're looking at how the markets are doing this morning. FTSE down a fraction. We'll have all the details on that. And indeed, Tesla's falling sales up next here on Business Live.
show of military might and menace. Why should the West trust you?
Frankly, I don't care whether the West trusts us or not.
Sky News. Get the full story first.
Have a quick word for Sky News. Is the West right? Are you fueling Russia's war machine? American journalist Evan Gershkovich is on trial here, but was first on display.
I'm Ivor Bennett, Sky's Moscow correspondent.
Staying connected is vital for business. Sky Business sponsors this report. Sky Business sponsors this report.
Right, let's have a look at those markets in more detail now. Delighted to say we're joined by Emma Wall, Head of Platform Investments at Hoggins Lansdowne. Emma, always a pleasure. Good morning to you. We saw a bit of a rally yesterday following Donald Trump's statement on EU trading relations. My word, it is quite the roller coaster, and all seems to be on the whim of Mr. Trump's media posts.
Yeah, very much so. The FTSE is around flat currently, but in the morning we have seen it gain quite a few points during morning trading. And as you say, this is a hangover from positive sentiment yesterday, where we did see global markets rise on the hope that between the EU and the US, we'd see a trade deal. As ever, I'm rather cautious. Rome wasn't built in a day, as I believe I've said before. Just because we're having positive rhetoric doesn't mean we're getting a positive trade deal. Underneath the bonnet, I think there has been some good news on specific UK stocks today. We're seeing defence stocks continue to do very well on the expectation of continued trading. And one interesting one, Kingfisher, which is the owner of B&Q, actually saw sales surge in its latest results, although strangely the share price has fallen slightly, so perhaps the market was even more optimistic than those sales suggested off the back of positive or very good weather in the UK, a good strong spring that we've had, which often leads to UK consumers spending on things like barbecues.
And indeed, and DIY, apparently. And not that, frankly, I would know too much about that. I'm not very good at DIY. Let's talk about Tesla, though, because am I right in thinking that the sales of their cars have dropped by some 50% in places in Europe?
Yeah, that's right. So the April figure, the month of April, year on year, sales have dropped 50%. And also, if you look at kind of year to date, you can see that that is not just an April concern. Sales are actually down 40% in aggregate year to date versus the year previously. And to compound the issues for Tesla, if you look at that in the backdrop of how EV sales are done across Europe for the same period, they're actually up 28%. So not only is Tesla doing poorly, but it's doing poorly against a growing market. And there's a couple of things at play here. One is very Tesla specific, and that's the fact that actually sentiment towards Elon Musk, of course, the infamous founder of Tesla, has really cooled due to not just his political stance in the US, but also some of his political stances here in the UK and in Europe as well. There's been a real sort of consumer backlash against the idea of a US domiciled CEO getting involved in sort of domestic politics. Another one is to do with the fact that they actually had to close their factory to update some of their machinery. So it's both a supply and demand issue. And coming then to fill the space is much cheaper, much more plentiful cars from Chinese manufacturers. So Tesla's really going to have to turn itself around in terms of that supply demand.
And just briefly, Emma, just talk us through the IMF and Rachel Reeves yesterday. Have they give her a bit of political cover to change her fiscal rules?
Yeah, so the IMF, a bit of good news for the IMF. So they've actually upgraded the growth expectation for this year. They're up from 1.1% to 1.2%. What I think is really interesting, though, is a lot of the data they were using for momentum was through January, February, March, which is, of course, before we had Liberation Day and the impact on growth that may have, and also before we had the implementation of the national insurance contributions. What they have said to Rachel Reeves is, if I may paraphrase, you're on the right track, but be careful not to leave yourself so little headroom in your very strict fiscal rules that you get yourself into a bit of a tight corner when it comes to the autumn budget. So that's one in Rachel Reeves' court now.
OK, Emma, as always, great stuff. Thank you very much indeed. Emma Wall there from Hargreaves Lansdown. Thank you. OK, that is it from me for the moment. We'll be back this afternoon at 4:30, which will include a special report from Ed Conway from Leicester in terms of its manufacturing industry around garments. Do join us then if you can. Up next, though, it is the rest of the day's news with Gareth Barlow, including the latest on Thames Water from Liverpool too, and also President Zelensky's visit to Germany. Stay tuned for that, and I'll see you this afternoon. Goodbye.